opportunities, it gets heavily into debt and destroys itself, and then ends up as a tourist attraction. So the suggestion, therefore, is that yes, what we're seeing today is not just a repeat of the usual cycles, but we're actually seeing a transition, a handing over of power, effectively, of the United States, from the United States across to China, possibly ultimately across to India. Therefore, as you'll see on the handout number 8, don't get fooled by the economic spin. Despite the talk of green shoots, the underlying causes of the American economic crisis still exist. They are the loss of manufacturing, increased unemployment, and the good jobs that are going offshore. So in other words, that America may well be reviving its economy, but in small ways. There's been a big debate amongst American economists as to whether you can regard flipping hamburgers as a skilled activity. If you do regard working in flipping hamburgers as a skilled activity, you can move that number of labourers, statistically speaking, out of the area of being low-skilled labour to high-skilled labour, and therefore distorts the view about the number of high-skilled jobs that still exist within the United States, if you redefine what it is to flip hamburgers. Meanwhile, in the United States, the banks remain unrepentant. Politicians are unwilling or unable to take on the major banks. There's increasing public anger. The politicians won't help poor people, but they will help the banks. We're seeing this politics of anger through the rise of what's called the Tea Party movement, a very interesting development, originally within the Republican Party, but it's now cutting into the Republican Party as well as the Democrats. A lot of angry people out there, and we're getting now the record sales of guns and ammunition in the United States. You'll be glad to know, if you are a gun holder, that when you go to Starbucks, you can now wear your gun openly. Starbucks have realised that their old ban on wearing guns going into Starbucks in the United States was costing them customers. So one of the leading points of difference now between themselves and McDonald's, McDonald's still bans guns, but Starbucks don't. So you can wear your gun when you go in and buy your cup of Starbucks coffee. So what we're looking at then is an increasing culture of violence, of viciousness. We see it also in the form of the political discourse, as the people within the United States just gradually continue to claw at each other. So what are the implications? Well, Australia, despite the hysteria over the asylum seekers, is a long way from the major places of conflict. I teach on the Sydney campus of Boston University. My American students cannot understand why people get hysterical about a few hundred asylum seekers trying to come to this country. Somebody enters the United States legally or illegally at the rate of 1 every 18 seconds. There are at least 10 million undocumented workers in the United States, and we get worried about 350 people. Americans just can't understand that. So we are a long way from the major places of conflict. Remember, you can't walk into this country. You can walk into the United States. You can walk across Western Europe. You can't walk into Australia. We've also got the changing nature of conflict. We've got fewer international conflicts. It's what's called the McDonald's Golden Arches theory of world peace. No two countries that sold McDonald's have gone to war against each other. Trade knits the world together. So we've actually had a declining number of wars and people killed in wars. Now, I know you won't get that impression from my TV coverage in the morning because you guys want wars and we've got to give you wars every morning. But it's interesting to note that if you look at the period from 1900 until today, the most dangerous period to have been alive was 1900 until 1950, the onset of the Korean War. That's when most people were killed in wars. Since 1950, the onset of the Korean War, we've seen a gradual reduction in the number of people killed in wars and the number of international wars. Trade is knitting the world together. Look at, for example, at France and Germany. For 1,000 years, the Franks and the Huns, the French and the Germans have fought each other. Now they are working together. Trade has knitted them together. So obviously there would be an opposition to going to war now between France and Germany. Why kill those people? They're our customers. So we see that trade is making the world a safer place. Meanwhile, many of the long-term indicators suggest that Asia is on track for rapid economic growth. Rising expectations, rising incomes, improved health and education, increased status for women. 300 million Chinese have been lifted out of poverty in the last 3 decades, one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. I know there are a lot of people still left in poverty in China, particularly at the western side, but nonetheless, progress is being made. And so Australia will just have to get used to China, or perhaps India, as our great and powerful friend, and not the United States or the United Kingdom. Remember, since the settlement here in Sydney, just over 200 years ago, we've always had a great and powerful friend. Always white, always speaking English. Originally Great Britain, and now, or more recently, since Pearl Harbor, the United States. Now, I'm suggesting perhaps we're going to have to get used to the Chinese or India being our great and powerful friend. Meanwhile, the United States, currently our great and powerful friend, will have its own domestic problems to sort out. For example, by the year 2050, whites will be in a minority, and the United States will be a nation of minorities, and the United States will be a major Spanish-speaking country. Already 10% of the Mexicans live in the United States. So America will be consumed with its own internal issues rather than trying to be the global police officer. On the other hand, I do suggest that if China's environment continues to decline, could Australia become the breadbasket of China? So in fact, it is Chinese policy that by the year 2020, everyone in China will eat 300 eggs per person per year. In order to have 300 eggs per person per year, they need 1.2 billion chickens. To feed 1.2 billion chickens, they're going to have to import all the grain that Australia produces in that year 2020. So providing we can look after our own topsoil, then in fact we can become the breadbasket of China, not only selling raw materials, but also seeing a rural recovery in this country. Let me get on to my third scenario, which I'm calling breakdown. This time it really is different. Always beware of any financial person who says this time it's different. It usually isn't, just as the beginning of another cycle. Perhaps this time it really is different. The global financial crisis masks a really serious one, which is environmental decline and resource depletion. So in other words, we're focusing a lot on the economics, but it's actually the environment that's the real problem. And you'll note there this phrase blowback, which traditionally is a political concern. For example, arming Osama bin Laden against the Soviets, which is what the Americans did in the 1970s, early 80s, who then later turned against the United States. That's blowback. So in other words, that you have these unintended consequences. Now it is developing a natural, an environmental component. For example, we're getting wonderful economic growth, but it's now leading to resource scarcity. So economies used to be able to recover from recessions through economic growth. Remember, I've talked about these cycles. It goes all the back 300 years we've had cycles. But we've always had resources that will be available to help us for the next economic boom. Now the growth is more problematic because of the consumption of resources. We have increasing population, there's a risk of the resource wars, and there's a shortage of water. 1/3 of all the world's population today is water stressed. By the year 2050, it'll be 2/3 of the world's population will be water stressed. Meanwhile, there is speculation about climate change, and the governments don't know what to do about it. So in other words, we're heading for a looming environmental crisis. My organisation, the Club of Rome, in 1972, argued that there were limits to growth. Our book appeared in 1972 at a time when we had recovered from World War II, and we thought we were going to aim for being on a plateau. That economic growth was ticking over quite nicely. Providing we didn't have a war with the Soviets, we were going to be fine. We're going to move towards some sort of economic nirvana because we're all basically Keynesian economists and we knew how to work it out to get economic growth.